a woman notices strange spots on her beloved golden retriever's belly. At first, she thinks it's nothing, but as the days pass, the spots multiply. Panic sets in. She rushes to the vet, desperate for answers. But when the doctor looks up with a troubled expression, what he says next changes everything. Because these spots aren't just a warning for her dog, they're a warning for her. A life or death mystery unfolds, leading to a shocking discovery that will test her faith, her fears, and the bond she shares with the only companion she has left. How did Buddy know? And can she save them both before it's too late? Stay tuned. This story is one you'll never forget. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Maggie Lawson's bedroom wall as she stirred awake. The gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming spring flowers through her open window, making the curtains dance softly. Outside, birds chirped their morning songs, welcoming the new day. At her feet, Buddy's warm weight shifted as he sensed her stirring. "Good morning, sweet boy," she whispered, her voice still rough with sleep. Buddy's tail thumped against the mattress in response, and he inched closer to rest his head on her leg. The old wooden floors creaked familiarly under her feet as she made her way to the kitchen. Buddy padding along beside her, his nails clicking softly against the hardwood. The coffee maker hummed to life with a push of a button, and soon the rich aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. While waiting for her morning brew, Maggie popped 2 slices of bread into the toaster and pulled her favorite jam from the refrigerator. The routine was comforting, a dance she'd perfected over the years. Coffee, toast, porch, simple steps that helped her start each day, giving her the structure she needed since Richard passed. Maggie settled into her favorite wicker chair on the porch, cradling her steaming coffee mug. The chair's familiar creak welcomed her as she sank into its cushions. Buddy sprawled at her feet, his golden fur catching the morning light like spun silk. She reached down to stroke his coat, and he leaned into her touch, eyes half closed in contentment. "Such a good boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears just the way he liked. Later that morning, as sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the carpet, Maggie's eyes caught the photograph on the mantel. There they were, she and Richard, both younger and laughing, with a puppy Buddy between them. Richard's smile was so bright, so alive, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Her throat tightened as she remembered that day, the way Richard had insisted on getting the perfect shot. "Come here, boy," she called to Buddy, patting her lap. "Time for your brushing." Buddy trotted over, his whole body wiggling with excitement, before flopping onto his back without prompting. His tongue lolled out in pure joy as she began brushing his coat, working through the tangles with gentle strokes. His back leg kicked rhythmically as she hit all his favorite spots, making her smile despite herself. That's when she saw them, small dark spots scattered across his belly near his hind legs, standing out against his pink skin. Her hand froze mid-brush. Buddy looked up at her, head tilted in confusion at the sudden stop, his brown eyes full of questions. "Hold still, sweetie," she whispered, gently running her fingers over the spots. They were smooth, not raised like the bumps she'd worried about before when he'd had that skin infection. Her heart quickened, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to push away the memories of how Richard's illness had started with something that had seemed so small. Buddy rolled over and gave her hand a reassuring lick, his whiskers tickling her palm. His tail wagged just as enthusiastically as always, and when she glanced at his food bowl, she noticed he'd eaten his breakfast with his usual gusto, not a kibble left behind. "It's probably nothing," she said aloud, more to convince herself than anything else. Still, a nagging worry settled in her stomach as she went about her day, dusting and tidying rooms that were already clean. That evening, after dinner, Maggie couldn't resist checking again. Buddy lay contentedly on his back in his favorite spot by the fireplace, enjoying his nightly belly rubs. The spots were still there, dark against his pale skin, like tiny shadows that shouldn't exist. Were they darker than this morning? She squinted, trying to be sure, but the fading light made it hard to tell, and her eyes weren't what they used to be. With a heavy sigh, Maggie switched off the living room lamp, leaving only the soft glow of the porch light filtering through the windows. "We're both just getting older, aren't we, boy?" she said softly, giving Buddy one final pat before heading to bed. He followed close behind, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of all she had to lose. Maggie's eyes fluttered open as the first rays of morning light filtered through her curtains. The bedside clock read 7 a.m. She stretched, her joints creaking slightly with familiar stiffness, and called out, "Buddy? Where's my good boy?" The familiar click-clack of paws on hardwood answered her call as Buddy trotted into the bedroom, and his tail wagging in cheerful greeting. His golden fur caught the morning light, making him look like he was glowing. Maggie smiled at his enthusiasm. Some things never changed, even after all these years together. In the kitchen, she went through her morning routine, carefully measuring coffee grounds while Buddy settled into his usual spot near her feet, his warm presence comforting and constant. As she reached down to give him his morning pat, her hand froze. The spots she'd noticed yesterday had spread. What had been a few dark patches near his hind legs now dotted his chest and ran down all four legs, stark against his golden coat. "Oh, Buddy," she whispered, her throat tightening with worry. Her fingers trembled as she traced the new spots, and her mind raced with possibilities she didn't want to consider. After a hurried breakfast of toast she barely tasted, Maggie sat at her kitchen table, laptop open before her. The coffee beside her grew cold and bitter as she typed various combinations into the search bar. Dog dark spots appearing suddenly, skin changes in older dogs, golden retriever skin conditions. Her fingers moved faster with each new search, driven by mounting concern. The results made her stomach churn, heat rash, fungal infections, allergies. But there were other possibilities too. Ones that made her heart pound against her ribs and her hands grow clammy. She closed several tabs quickly, not wanting to read further, not ready to face what those words might mean. Buddy lay in a patch of sunlight nearby, watching her with bright, trusting eyes. He'd wolfed down his breakfast as usual and now played with his favorite rope toy, tossing it in the air and catching it, showing no signs of discomfort. When she called him over, he bounded to her side, tail wagging with unbridled joy. "You're fine, aren't you, boy?" she said, scratching behind his ears where he loved it most. "Just a reaction to something? Maybe that new detergent?" Her voice carried a hopeful note she didn't quite feel. But throughout the day she couldn't stop checking him, pulling back his fur to examine his skin. Every time she looked, the spots seemed darker, more defined, spreading like ink on wet paper. Or was her worry making her imagine things? She found herself taking pictures with her phone, comparing them obsessively. Evening settled in, and Maggie sat in her armchair by the fireplace, trying to focus on her book, but reading the same paragraph over and over. Buddy dozed at her feet, peaceful and content, his gentle snores mixing with the crackle of burning wood. The orange glow from the flames cast dancing shadows across his fur, but couldn't hide the dark patches that had so suddenly appeared. She set her book down and picked up her phone, turning it over and over in her hands, the cool case smooth against her palm. The worry that had been building all day finally won out. With a deep breath that did little to steady her nerves, she dialed Dr. Patel's clinic. "Hello," she said, when the receptionist answered, her voice slightly shaky. "This is Maggie Lawson. I need to make an appointment for Buddy. It's about some spots that have appeared on his skin." She listened as the receptionist checked the schedule, her free hand absently stroking Buddy's head. They set up an appointment for the following day. After hanging up, Maggie felt both relieved and anxious, the dual emotions warring in her chest. At least they'd know something definite tomorrow, though part of her wondered if not knowing might be easier. The morning air held a crisp bite as Maggie helped Buddy into the passenger seat of her blue Honda. Fallen leaves skittered across the driveway, their rustle matching the flutter of anxiety in her chest. She circled to the driver's side, each step measured and deliberate, fighting the urge to rush. "Ready for a little trip, boy?" she asked, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. Buddy's response was to stick his head out the window, his ears flapping in the wind as they drove down the quiet country road. His joy was so pure, so uncomplicated, exactly what Richard had loved most about him. The veterinary clinic parking lot was half full when they arrived. Inside, the waiting room smelled of antiseptic and pet shampoo. A cat meowed softly from its carrier while its owner filled out paperwork. Maggie sat in one of the blue plastic chairs, her purse clutched tight in her lap, fingers drumming an irregular rhythm against the worn leather. Buddy sat at her feet, tail thumping against the linoleum floor whenever someone walked past. He showed no signs of distress, which somehow made everything worse. If he'd been in pain, at least she would have known what they were dealing with. "Buddy Lawson?" a young assistant called from the doorway, clipboard in hand. Dr. Patel was waiting in the examination room, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, white coat pristine. His smile was warm and familiar. He'd been Buddy's vet since Richard first brought home the golden ball of fluff 8 years ago. "Good morning, Maggie," he said, his voice carrying that gentle authority that had always put her at ease. "Let's have a look at what's troubling our friend here." Buddy wagged his tail as doctor. Patel ran his hands along his sides, checking the spots that had appeared so suddenly. The vet's expression remained professional, but Maggie caught the slight furrow of his brow, the way his lips pressed together as he examined each dark patch. "Have you changed anything in his diet?" Dr. Patel asked, fingers probing gently around the spots. "Any new shampoo, bedding, or flea treatments?" Maggie shook her head. "No, nothing's different. Everything's the same as always." Her voice sounded smaller than she intended. Dr. Patel straightened up, reaching for his clipboard. "I'd like to run some tests," he said, making notes. "We'll need to take blood samples and do a few other checks. Rule things out." The knot in Maggie's stomach tightened. She gripped Buddy's leash harder, the leather warm and familiar in her palm. "How long until we know something?" "I'll call you as soon as we have the results, Doctor," Patel assured her. "Probably tomorrow morning." The drive home seemed longer than usual. Buddy still hung his head out the window, tongue lolling in the wind. But Maggie could barely focus on the road. Dr. Patel's careful neutrality, the slight shift in his expression when he'd examined the spots, it all played on repeat in her mind. She'd seen that look before, on another doctor's face 5 years ago, when Richard. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing the thought away. The evening sun cast long shadows through Maggie's kitchen window as she wiped down the counters for the 3rd time. Her movements were mechanical, mind elsewhere as she scrubbed imaginary spots. Buddy watched from his usual spot near the refrigerator, head tilted to one side. "We should eat something," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She pulled out a plate but couldn't bring herself to fill it. Instead, she straightened the placemat, adjusted the fork, moved the glass slightly to the left. The routine of setting the table felt like a lifeline to normalcy. The phone's sharp ring cut through the quiet house. Maggie's hand trembled as she dried them on her apron. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the receiver. "Hello? Maggie, this is Dr. Patel. I have the test results." His voice was gentle, measured. She gripped the phone tighter, knuckles turning white. "Yes? The good news is, it's not cancer." The relief hit her like a wave, making her knees weak. She steadied herself against the kitchen counter. "Oh, thank goodness. But I need to talk to you about something else." The careful tone in his voice made her stomach clench. "What is it?" "The spots we found on Buddy, they're remarkably similar to early symptoms of a specific medical condition in humans. I've seen it before." He paused. "Maggie, I strongly recommend you schedule an appointment with your doctor. Soon." The kitchen seemed to tilt sideways. "I don't understand. What does Buddy's condition have to do with me?" "Sometimes our pets can sense things before we do. They can react to chemical changes in our bodies, changes we might not notice yet." His words were kind, but firm. "Please just get checked, for Buddy's sake, if not your own." After hanging up, Maggie sank into her armchair by the fireplace. The flames crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Her mind raced with questions she wasn't ready to face. Buddy patted over and settled his head on her lap, his warm brown eyes fixed on her face. She ran her fingers through his soft fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "What are you trying to tell me, old friend?" she whispered. The fire popped and sparked, its warmth not quite reaching the cold knot of dread in her stomach. Everything felt different now, as if the familiar corners of her home had shifted ever so slightly, leaving her off balance in a place she thought she knew by heart. Maggie blinked awake to the soft morning light filtering through her curtains. Her head felt heavy, thoughts clouded from a restless night. She hadn't moved from her bed yet, finding strange comfort in studying the familiar cracks in her bedroom ceiling. Dr. Patel's words from yesterday echoed in her mind, each replay making her heart beat a little faster. Buddy's wet nose pressed against her hand, his warm breath tickling her skin. She scratched behind his ears without looking at him, her other hand resting on her stomach. "What am I supposed to do, boy?" she whispered. Her phone sat on the nightstand, silent, but somehow threatening. Every fiber of her being wanted to ignore it, to pretend yesterday's conversation never happened. The morning ticked by slowly. Maggie made coffee but barely touched it, watching the steam rise and disappear. At 10 o'clock, after pacing the kitchen for what felt like hours, she finally picked up her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed Dr. Harris's office. "Good morning, Doctor." "Harris's office," a cheerful voice answered. "Hi, this is Margaret Lawson. I ... She swallowed hard. "I need to schedule a checkup." "We actually had a cancellation for this afternoon at 2:30. Would that work for you?" Maggie's throat tightened. She hadn't expected it to be so soon. "Yes," she heard herself say. "That would be fine." After hanging up, she couldn't sit still. She grabbed the vacuum cleaner and started in the living room, then moved to the kitchen. She wiped down surfaces that were already clean, reorganized drawers that didn't need organizing. Buddy followed her from room to room, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors. "I know what you're thinking," she muttered, catching his concerned gaze as she folded the same towel for the third time. "You think I'm being ridiculous, don't you?" Buddy tilted his head, his tail wagging slowly. By 2 o'clock, Maggie stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing down her blouse. The woman staring back at her looked tired, worried. She tried to smile, but it felt more like a grimace. Her hands fidgeted with her necklace, adjusting it needlessly. She grabbed her purse from the bed and picked up Buddy's leash from the hook by the door. He was already waiting, sitting patiently beside her. "Let's get this over with," she whispered, clipping the leash to his collar. Her voice sounded small in the quiet house, but Buddy's presence beside her gave her the strength to take that first step toward the door. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Harris's waiting room buzzed overhead, making Maggie's already frayed nerves feel even more raw. She gripped her purse tightly, forcing a polite smile as she signed in at the front desk. The clipboard trembled slightly in her hands as she filled out the paperwork. "Mrs. Lawson," a nurse in blue scrubs called her name just minutes later. "We can take you back now." The examination room felt too small, too sterile. Maggie perched on the edge of the paper-covered table, the crinkling sound beneath her making her jump. Her fingers drummed an unsteady rhythm against her knee as she waited. Dr. Harris entered with a gentle knock, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the harsh overhead light. "Maggie," he said warmly, though his eyes were serious as he flipped through her chart. "What brings you in today?" She explained about Buddy, about Doctor Patel's concerns, her voice growing quieter with each word. Dr. Harris listened intently, nodding. "Let's take a look," he said, pulling on latex gloves. "I'll need you to change into this gown." The examination was thorough and methodical. Dr. Harris's hands were warm through the gloves as he checked her skin, starting at her scalp and working his way down. When he reached her back, she felt him pause. "There's a spot here," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "On your shoulder blade. How long has this been here?" Maggie's throat went dry. I don't know. I can't see my back very well." "I'd like to do a biopsy," he said, "just to be safe." The word biopsy hit her like a physical blow. "Today?" she managed to whisper. "I think that would be best." His tone was gentle but firm. "It's just precautionary, Maggie." The procedure was quick, a sharp pinch, a strange pressure, then the cool sensation of antiseptic and bandages. But it left Maggie feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. "We should have the results in 2 days," Dr. Harris said, making notes in her chart. "Try not to worry too much until then." Later in the parking lot, Maggie's hands shook so badly she had to take several deep breaths before she could grip the steering wheel properly. Buddy's tail thumped against the back seat, his happy panting filling the car with familiar comfort. "It's probably nothing," she whispered, but the words felt hollow in the quiet car. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the darkness as Maggie sat at her wooden table, steam rising from an untouched cup of chamomile tea. Buddy's gentle breathing was the only other sound in the too-quiet house. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the leather photo album she hadn't opened since before. With trembling hands, she lifted the cover. The first photo caught her breath, their wedding day. Richard's warm brown eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled at the camera, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. She touched his face through the plastic sleeve, remembering how his skin felt beneath her fingers. Page after page told their story. Their first tiny house with the crooked mailbox. Richard teaching a younger Buddy to fetch in the backyard. Their last trip to the beach, where they'd walked hand in hand at sunset, not knowing their time was running short. The memories washed over her like waves, bringing with them the pain she'd tried so hard to bury. 5 years ago, sitting at this very table, Richard had reached for her hand. "The test came back," he'd said softly. "It's not good, Mags." She remembered every excruciating detail of what followed, the endless doctor's appointments, the way his clothes hung looser each week, the hospital stays that grew longer and longer. Through it all, Richard had tried to stay strong for her, smiling even when pain etched deep lines around his mouth. "It'll be okay, sweetheart," he'd whisper, while she arranged his pillows or helped him sip water. But it hadn't been okay. Nothing had been okay since. Buddy's warm head settled on her lap, pulling her back to the present. His brown eyes, so full of concern, looked up at her. She ran her fingers through his soft fur, feeling the tears she'd been holding back start to fall. "I can't do it again," she whispered into the darkness. "I can't watch someone else." She couldn't finish the sentence. The fear wrapped around her chest like an iron band. She'd seen what cancer did. She'd watched it steal everything: dignity, hope, life itself. The thought of going through that herself, of facing those same battles. Standing up abruptly, she walked to the kitchen window. The night pressed against the glass, dark and endless. Buddy's nails clicked on the floor as he followed, staying close as always. In the reflection of the window, she saw herself, pale, tired, afraid. Her decision crystallized in that moment, hard and cold as ice. She wouldn't fight. She wouldn't put herself through what Richard endured. She wouldn't do it. She stood there, letting the darkness of the night mirror the darkness growing in her heart as the clock ticked past midnight. Maggie woke to pale sunlight filtering through her curtains. Her chest felt heavy, but not from illness, from decision. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her finger hovering over Doctor Harris's number. With a deep breath, she pressed call. "Yes, I need to cancel my follow-up appointment," she said quietly. "No, I won't be rescheduling." She ignored the concern in the receptionist's voice and ended the call quickly. The wooden floors creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the kitchen. Buddy's nails clicked behind her, following so closely he nearly tripped her twice. "Careful there, boy," she murmured, stepping around him to reach the coffee maker. But Buddy wouldn't give her space. He pressed against her legs, whining softly. When she moved to the living room, he was right there. When she tried to read the morning paper, he nudged her hand with his nose until the pages crinkled. "Stop that," she said, gentler than she meant to. "I'm fine." Buddy's brown eyes fixed on her face, full of something that looked too much like worry. He pawed at her knee, whimpering, "Oh, come here." Maggie knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears the way he loved. "Everything's okay. I promise." But Buddy wasn't buying it. All day he stayed glued to her side. When she tried to close the bathroom door, he scratched at it until she let him in. While she folded laundry, he lay across her feet. During dinner, he rested his head on her lap, refusing his own food bowl. "You're being silly," she told him, but her voice wavered. That night, Maggie pulled back her covers and patted Buddy's bed in the corner. "Time for sleep, boy." Instead of settling into his usual spot, Buddy jumped onto her bed, pressing his warm body against her side. She tried to push him toward his bed, but he wouldn't budge. He just looked at her with those knowing eyes and settled in closer. "Fine," she sighed, turning off the bedside lamp. "Just for tonight." Darkness filled the room, but sleep stayed far away. Maggie stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind in the trees outside. Buddy's fur tickled her arm, his steady presence both comforting and unsettling. Just before exhaustion finally pulled her under, she heard it, a soft, worried whine in the darkness. Maggie's eyes snapped open before her alarm, something nagging at the edges of her consciousness. The early morning light cast long shadows across her bedroom wall. But something was missing. Buddy's familiar morning greeting. Her heart skipped a beat. Every morning for 8 years he'd been there, tail wagging, ready for their walk. But today, silence filled the house. "Buddy?" Her voice trembled as she threw back the covers. Her bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor as she hurried to the living room. There he was, lying by the cold fireplace. His golden fur seemed dull in the dim light, and when she called his name again, he barely lifted his head. "Oh, no, no, no." Maggie knelt beside him, her hands shaking as they ran through his fur. "What's wrong, boy?" She rushed to the kitchen, grabbing his favorite bowl and filling it with food. The kibble rattled against the metal, a sound that usually had him bounding over. But Buddy just lay there, turning his head away when she placed the bowl near his nose. "Please eat, sweetie," she begged, her voice cracking. "Just a little bit." When he tried to stand, his legs wobbled beneath him. He managed 2 shaky steps before sinking back down, his breathing heavy. Maggie's stomach lurched as she noticed the spots on his belly and legs. They were darker now, almost black against his skin. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold her phone. She misdialed Dr. Patel's number twice before getting it right. "Dr. Patel's Animal Hospital," the receptionist answered. "This is Maggie Lawson," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Something's wrong with Buddy. He won't eat, can barely walk, and those spots, they're worse." "Bring him in right away," the receptionist said, her tone shifting to urgent. "Dr. Patel will see him immediately." Maggie grabbed her car keys and the soft blanket from the couch. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, wrapping it gently around him. "We're going to get help." It took all her strength to lift him. He'd always been a big dog, but now he felt like dead weight in her arms. She struggled to the car, her back protesting, and carefully laid him across the back seat. The morning traffic crawled by as she sped toward the clinic, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every red light felt like torture. In the rearview mirror, she could see Buddy lying still, too still. "Just hold on, Bud," she whispered, pressing harder on the gas pedal. "Please, just hold on." Maggie burst through the clinic doors, her arms trembling under Buddy's weight. His golden fur was matted with sweat, his breathing shallow. The waiting room fell silent as she stumbled forward. "Help! Please, someone help!" Dr. Patel emerged from behind the counter, his eyes widening at the sight. "Bring him here, quickly!" He led them straight to an examination room, bypassing the usual check-in process. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dr. Patel gently lifted Buddy onto the metal table. His hands moved swiftly, checking vitals, while a nurse rushed in with supplies. "When did this start?" Dr. Patel asked, pressing a stethoscope to Buddy's chest. "This morning," Maggie's voice cracked. "He wouldn't get up, wouldn't eat. He's never refused food before, never—" "We need to run some tests," Dr. Patel interrupted gently. "Sarah, start an IV drip. We need to get fluids in him right away." Maggie paced the small room, her shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. She bit her nails down to the quick, watching as they drew blood and hooked Buddy up to monitors. The steady beep of his heart rate filled the room. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Buddy lay still on the table, his eyes following Maggie's movement. Even now, he was trying to comfort her. When Dr. Patel finally returned, clutching a clipboard, Maggie froze mid-step. His face was serious, his brow furrowed. "I have the results," he said, glancing at the papers. "Buddy's immune system is under attack. But it's not a disease. It's something in his environment." Maggie gripped the edge of the examination table. "You mean something in my house?" "Yes," Dr. Patel nodded gravely. "His symptoms suggest exposure to some kind of toxin. The spots on his skin, the sudden lethargy. These are reactions to something he's coming into contact with regularly." Maggie stared at Buddy, her mind spinning. What could be making him so sick? What had changed? The drive home was a blur. Maggie gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as questions raced through her mind. She'd left Buddy at the clinic for observation, but Dr. Patel's words echoed in her ears. Something in her house was poisoning her best friend. Maggie's hand shook as she unlocked her front door. The house felt empty without Buddy's familiar greeting, his wagging tail, and happy bark. Dr. Patel's words echoed in her mind. Something in her home was making him sick. She dropped her purse on the floor and started her search. In the kitchen, she examined Buddy's food bowl and water dish. Everything looked normal. She checked his kibble, sniffing it carefully, but it was the same brand they'd used for years. Moving to the living room, she inspected his favorite sleeping spots. The cushion by the window, the rug near the fireplace. Nothing seemed out of place. Her heart raced as she moved from room to room, growing more frustrated with each dead end. In the hallway, she paused by the laundry room door. Something tugged at her memory. 2 weeks ago, the store had been out of her usual detergent. She'd bought a different brand, one that promised superior cleaning power. Maggie rushed into the laundry room, yanking open the cabinet under the sink. There it sat, the new bottle with its bright packaging and promises of deep cleaning. Her hands trembled as she turned it over, scanning the list of ingredients. The chemical names were long and unfamiliar. Warning labels dotted the back. "Oh no," she whispered, her stomach dropping. She hurried to Buddy's bed in the corner of her bedroom. Pressing her face into the fabric, she inhaled deeply. The artificial scent was overwhelming. How had she not noticed before? All of Buddy's blankets, her own clothes, the throw pillows on the couch. Everything had been washed with this new detergent. Maggie sank to her knees beside Buddy's bed, clutching the detergent bottle. The truth hit her like a physical blow. She had done this. Her simple change in laundry soap had been slowly poisoning her best friend. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks as she staggered to her feet. With a choked sob, she threw the bottle into the kitchen trash can, the sound of it hitting the bottom echoing through the quiet house. "I did this to you," she whispered, her voice breaking in the empty room. Thunder rolled across the darkening sky as Maggie sat motionless in her living room. The steady patter of rain against the windows matched the rhythm of her racing thoughts. Each flash of lightning illuminated the empty dog bed in the corner, making her heart ache. "I should have known," she whispered to the empty room. The new detergent bottle sat on the coffee table like evidence of her guilt. Such a simple thing, a change in laundry soap, had caused so much pain. Her eyes drifted to the mantel where Richard's photo stood. His smile, frozen in time, seemed to hold a gentle reproach. She thought of how attentive he'd been with Buddy when the dog was just a puppy. Richard would have noticed the signs sooner. He would have acted faster. The storm grew fiercer as evening settled in. Maggie pulled Richard's photo into her lap, tracing his face with trembling fingers. "I messed up, Richard," she whispered. "I've been so scared of ending up like you that I stopped living altogether." Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of brightness, she saw everything clearly. How she'd ignored the spots on Buddy's skin, dismissed his increasingly anxious behavior, canceled her own doctor's appointment. All because facing the truth meant facing her fears. "I'm sorry," she choked out, clutching the photo tighter. "I'm so sorry." The wind howled outside, branches scratching against the windows like accusatory fingers. She thought about Buddy alone at the vet's office, hooked up to IVs because she'd been too blind to see what was happening. And her own health, what was she doing about that? Running away, just like she'd been running from everything else since Richard died. A sudden sharp knock at the door made her jump. The photo nearly slipped from her hands, and she quickly set it back on the mantel. Another knock, more insistent this time. Maggie walked slowly to the door, wiping her eyes. When she opened it, there stood Ruth, completely drenched, her short gray hair plastered to her head. Her expression was thunderous, matching the storm behind her. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ruth demanded, water dripping from her raincoat onto the welcome mat. Rain cascaded down Ruth's umbrella as she pushed past Maggie into the warmth of the house. Water dripped onto the hardwood floor, but Ruth didn't seem to notice or care. Her eyes blazed with a familiar determination that made Maggie's stomach clench. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Ruth demanded again, shrugging off her wet coat. "Doctor," Harris called me. "Said you canceled your appointment?" Maggie wrapped her arms around herself, avoiding Ruth's piercing gaze. "It's nothing. I'm fine." "Fine?" Ruth's voice rose. "Like you were fine after Richard died? When you wouldn't leave the house for weeks?" The mention of Richard made Maggie flinch. She moved toward the kitchen, needing space, but Ruth followed. The untouched plate of food on the counter caught Ruth's attention. "You're doing it again," Ruth said, her voice softening slightly. "Shutting down, pushing everyone away." "I'm not pushing anyone." "Really?" Ruth interrupted. "Then why is Buddy at the vet's? Why did you ignore the signs until he collapsed?" Maggie's hands gripped the edge of the counter. "That was different. The detergent." "Was just the final straw," Ruth cut in. "He was trying to tell you something was wrong and you wouldn't listen. And now you're canceling your own doctor's appointment, acting like it's all just coincidence?" Thunder crashed outside, making the windows rattle. Maggie's defenses rose. "I don't need saving, Ruth. I can handle this myself." Ruth stepped closer, her expression softening. "I think you do need saving. From yourself." She placed a gentle but firm hand on Maggie's shoulder. "I'm not leaving until you promise me something." Maggie felt tears burning behind her eyes. She was so tired of fighting, of pretending. "What?" she whispered. "That you'll fight," Ruth said simply. "Not just for Buddy, but for yourself, too." Sunlight filtered through the bedroom curtains as Maggie stirred awake, her head throbbing slightly. The events from last night with Ruth had left her drained, but somehow lighter. She turned in bed and found Buddy lying next to her, his golden form still weak, but his eyes bright and watchful. "Hey there, sweet boy," she whispered, reaching out to stroke his soft fur. His tail thumped weakly against the mattress. "I hear you, boy. I really do." Buddy inched closer, resting his head on her lap. The dark spots on his skin were starting to fade, but they served as a reminder of how close she'd come to losing him, and maybe herself. In the kitchen, Maggie sat at the worn wooden table, her coffee growing cold as she stared at her phone. Ruth's words from last night kept playing in her mind. "Open your damn eyes, Maggie." She picked up her phone, put it down, then picked it up again. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through her contacts and found Dr. Harris's number. The receptionist answered on the second ring. Maggie took a deep breath. "Hi, this is Maggie Lawson. I need to reschedule my appointment, the one I canceled." "Let me check the schedule," the receptionist said. After a moment of keyboard clicking, she added, "We have an opening tomorrow at 10 a.m. Would that work?" Maggie's heart raced. Tomorrow, so soon. She glanced at Buddy, who watched her from his bed in the corner. Before fear could take hold, she heard herself say, "Yes, that works. I'll take it." After hanging up, Maggie felt lighter, as if she'd set down a heavy burden she'd been carrying for weeks. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but it no longer controlled her. Later that afternoon, Maggie sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a cozy sweater against the autumn chill. Buddy lay at her feet, his breathing steady and peaceful. Leaves danced across the yard, carried by the wind in swirling patterns of red and gold. She reached down to scratch behind Buddy's ears. "We're going to get through this, Bud," she whispered. "Together." Buddy responded with a soft, contented sigh, his tail wagging gently against the wooden porch. Maggie woke before her alarm, the pale morning light barely peeking through her curtains. Her stomach felt like a tangle of knots, but underneath the anxiety was something stronger: determination. In the kitchen, she measured out Buddy's food with shaking hands. He approached his bowl slowly, still recovering, but getting stronger each day. Instead of rushing through their morning routine, she knelt beside him and cradled his furry face in her hands. "You saved me, didn't you?" she whispered, looking into his warm brown eyes. His tail thumped weakly against the floor in response, and he pressed his nose into her palm. "My guardian angel and golden fur." The drive to Dr. Harris's office felt surreal. Ruth sat in the passenger seat, having shown up at Maggie's door at 7:30 a.m. sharp, armed with coffee and unwavering support. "I'm not letting you do this alone," Ruth declared, squeezing Maggie's hand as they walked into the medical building. The gesture brought tears to Maggie's eyes, not of fear this time, but gratitude. Dr. Harris's office was quiet this early, the waiting room empty except for them. When the nurse called Maggie's name, Ruth stood up with her without hesitation. Dr. Harris greeted them with a gentle smile, spreading out some papers on his desk. "The procedure is fairly straightforward," he explained, pointing to a diagram. "We'll remove the melanoma and a small margin of surrounding tissue. Since we caught this early, the prognosis is excellent." Maggie nodded, surprised by the steadiness of her hands as she signed the consent forms. This wasn't like before, when she'd run from the truth. This time, she was facing it head-on. The operating room was cooler than she expected. As nurses bustled around her, preparing equipment and checking monitors, Ruth appeared with Buddy's leash in hand. "Found it in your car," she said softly. "Thought you might want it." Maggie clutched the worn leather leash, running her thumb over the spots where Buddy had chewed it as a puppy. The familiar texture grounded her as the anesthesiologist began explaining what would happen next. As the medication started flowing through her IV, Maggie felt her eyelids growing heavy. Her last conscious thought wasn't of fear or regret, but of profound gratitude. She wasn't alone in this. She had Ruth beside her, Buddy waiting at home, and finally, the courage to fight. Maggie blinked slowly, her eyelids heavy as she emerged from the fog of anesthesia. The hospital room came into focus gradually. First the white ceiling, then the soft beeping of monitors, and finally Ruth's familiar silhouette beside her bed. "Welcome back," Ruth said softly, setting her phone down. Her voice was gentle, a stark contrast to her usual direct manner. Maggie tried to speak, but her throat felt dry. Ruth quickly offered her a small cup of water with a straw. The cool liquid brought relief, and reality started settling in more clearly. "How long?" Maggie managed to whisper. "About 4 hours," Ruth replied, adjusting Maggie's blanket with motherly care. Everything went smoothly. The afternoon light filtered through the window blinds, creating patterns on the hospital floor. Maggie dozed on and off, grateful for Ruth's steady presence beside her. At 4 o'clock, Dr. Harris entered the room, his footsteps quiet on the linoleum floor. His smile was warm and reassuring as he approached her bed. "The surgery went well," he announced, checking her vitals. "We removed all the cancerous cells. The margins are clean." Relief flooded through Maggie's body, making her sink deeper into the pillows. She hadn't realized how much tension she'd been holding until it finally released. "You'll need time to heal," Ruth said, squeezing her hand. "But you did it, Maggie. You faced it head on." Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes. These weren't tears of fear or sadness like before. They were tears of gratitude, of release, of survival. As evening approached, exhaustion began to overtake her. The medication made her thoughts drift hazily, and she found herself sliding into sleep. In her dreams, she was home. Buddy was waiting on the porch, his tail wagging in that familiar rhythm. His spots faded to nothing but a memory. The image brought a small smile to her face as she drifted off completely. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window as Maggie stirred in her bed. The morning brought with it a strange mix of exhaustion and lightness. Her surgical sight ached, but somehow her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. Ruth sat in the corner, grimacing as she sipped what passed for coffee in the hospital cafeteria. When she noticed Maggie was awake, she quickly set the cup aside and stood up. "You look better," Ruth said, reaching over to smooth Maggie's blanket. Her touch was gentle, motherly, so different from her usual no-nonsense demeanor. Maggie managed a small smile. "I made it through." "Of course you did," Ruth replied, but her voice caught slightly. "Though you had me worried there for a while." At 9 o'clock, Dr. Harris arrived for his morning rounds. His presence brought a calm authority to the room as he checked Maggie's vital signs and examined the surgical site. "Everything looks exactly as it should," he said, making notes in her chart. "The surgery was successful and the margins are clear. You'll need plenty of rest, but you're definitely on the right path." Relief washed over Maggie, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt that made her throat tight. She'd almost let fear win. She'd almost ignored the warning signs, just like she'd ignored so many other things since Richard died. "I almost didn't come in," she admitted quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Ruth's hand found hers immediately. "But you did," Ruth said firmly. "That's what matters." Dr. Harris nodded in agreement. "The important thing is that you're here now. We caught it early thanks to that intuitive dog of yours." Maggie's eyes welled up at the mention of Buddy. She missed him terribly, even after just one night away. "How is he?" she asked Ruth. "Doctor, Patel says he's responding well to treatment. The spots are already starting to fade." Ruth squeezed her hand. "He's a fighter, just like his mom." As the morning wore on, Maggie felt the emotional weight of everything settling in. She'd come so close to making the wrong choice, so close to letting fear dictate her future. The thought made her shudder. When noon arrived, bringing with it another round of nurses and vital checks, Maggie closed her eyes against the fluorescent lights. "I just want to go home," she whispered. Ruth's hand found hers again, warm and steady. "Then let's get you there." The evening light cast long shadows across Maggie's living room as she settled onto her familiar couch. The drive home from the hospital had been quiet, but now, wrapped in her favorite blanket with Buddy's warm weight against her legs, she felt truly safe for the first time in days. Buddy's spots were already starting to fade, and though he was still weak, his eyes held that familiar loving glow. Ruth bustled around the kitchen, the gentle clink of cups and spoons filling the air. She returned with 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea, pressing one into Maggie's hands. "So," Ruth said, settling into the armchair across from her, "are you finally going to talk about it?" Maggie stared into her tea, watching the steam rise in delicate swirls. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth reaching across the room like a gentle embrace. She stroked Buddy's head, drawing comfort from his presence. She began, then stopped. The words felt stuck in her throat. Ruth waited patiently, sipping her tea. "I wasn't just afraid of the surgery," Maggie finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was afraid of reliving what happened to Richard, afraid of going through all of that again." The admission hung in the air between them. Buddy shifted closer, as if sensing her vulnerability. "I watched him fade away, Ruth. Day by day, treatment after treatment. I couldn't..." She swallowed hard. I couldn't face the possibility of going through that myself. Ruth set her tea down and leaned forward, her eyes soft but determined. You're not him, Maggie, and you're not alone. The simple truth of those words hit Maggie like a physical force. Tears welled up in her eyes as years of pent-up fear and grief finally found release. I've been here the whole time, Ruth continued, reaching across to squeeze Maggie's hand. And I'm not going anywhere. Neither is this furry guardian angel of yours. She nodded toward Buddy, who thumped his tail in agreement. Maggie felt something shift inside her chest, like a heavy weight finally lifting. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, it felt like her lungs could fully expand. As the evening drew to a close, Maggie stood at her bedroom door, pulling Ruth into a tight hug. Thank you, she whispered into her friend's shoulder. Ruth smiled, patting her back gently. That's what best friends do. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window as Maggie stirred to the gentle scratch of paws against her blanket. Buddy's concerned face appeared at her bedside, his brown eyes watchful and warm. Despite the lingering soreness from surgery, she felt different today, lighter somehow. Good morning, my sweet boy, she whispered, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. His tail wagged slowly, and he pressed his nose against her hand. The spots on his belly were noticeably lighter now, fading like morning mist. Maggie carefully sat up, wincing slightly at the pull of stitches. She took her time getting dressed, moving with deliberate gentleness. Buddy shadowed her every step, his protective instincts still on high alert. In the kitchen, she had just finished making her morning coffee when the phone rang. Dr. Harris's name flashed on the screen, sending her heart into a nervous flutter. She answered with slightly trembling fingers. Good morning, Maggie, his warm voice came through. I just wanted to check in on you. I'm doing okay, she replied, sinking into her kitchen chair. A bit sore, but... That's normal, he assured her. But I also have something to tell you. The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever. Maggie's fingers tightened around the phone. Your final test results came back, he continued. We got everything. No further treatment is needed. The words hung in the air like music. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. So, I'm okay? Her voice came out small, almost childlike. You're okay, doctor, Harris confirmed, the smile evident in his voice. Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes as the weight of those two simple words settled over her. She looked down at Buddy, who had rested his head on her knee, those wise eyes gazing up at her. After thanking Dr. Harris and hanging up the phone, she slid from her chair to the floor, wrapping her arms around Buddy's neck. We did it, Bud, she whispered into his fur, feeling his steady heartbeat against her chest. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves as Maggie settled into her favorite porch chair. Buddy lay at her feet, his golden fur catching the early afternoon sunlight. She watched the trees dance in the wind, their branches swaying like gentle waves. Everything looked different now, brighter, more vivid, more precious. She took a slow sip of tea, savoring its warmth. The wind chimes tinkled softly, a melody she'd heard 1,000 times before, but somehow never truly appreciated until now. A cardinal landed on the bird feeder, its red feathers brilliant against the weathered wood. Look at that, Buddy, she whispered. He lifted his head, ears perking up at her voice. As the afternoon stretched on, Maggie reached down to stroke Buddy's fur. The dark spots that had once alarmed her were barely visible now, just faint shadows beneath his golden coat. She traced her fingers over where they used to be, marveling at how something so frightening could lead to such profound change. You knew, didn't you? She murmured, scratching behind his ears. Buddy responded with a contented huff, his tail thumping gently against the porch boards. Those wise brown eyes looked up at her with such understanding that it made her heart ache. The realization washed over her like warm sunshine. How this beautiful creature had guided her through the darkest parts of her fear without speaking a single word. When she wanted to run, he had insisted on staying. When she tried to ignore the truth, he had made it impossible to look away. She noticed things now that she'd been too afraid to see before. The way the late afternoon light painted everything in honey gold, the cheerful chirping of sparrows in the maple tree, the peaceful rhythm of Buddy's breathing beside her. Each moment felt like a gift, wrapped in newfound gratitude. The fear that had gripped her heart so tightly was gone now, replaced by something stronger, a quiet determination to embrace every day, every moment, every breath. She wouldn't waste any more time hiding from life. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, Maggie sat quietly with her hand resting on Buddy's warm back. She made a silent promise to herself. No more running, no more letting fear win. It was time to truly live. The morning sunlight streamed through Maggie's bedroom window, painting golden patterns on her quilt. She opened her eyes slowly, expecting the familiar weight of anxiety to settle in her chest. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt oddly buoyant, as if someone had lifted a heavy blanket she'd been carrying for years. Buddy's tail thumped against the floor as she stretched and sat up. "Morning, boy," she said, her voice clear and strong. In the kitchen, she went through her morning routine with renewed energy. The coffee smelled richer, the toast tasted better, and even the morning air felt fresher as it drifted through the open window. At 9 o'clock, Maggie settled at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea. She smoothed out a crisp sheet of paper and picked up her favorite pen. Buddy curled up at her feet, his steady presence grounding her as always. "Dear Dr. Patel," she wrote, her handwriting flowing easily across the page, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You saw what I couldn't or wouldn't see. When you urged me to get checked, you weren't just being thorough. You were saving my life." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with her sleeve before continuing. "Because of you, we caught the melanoma early. Because of you, I'm still here." After signing the letter, she pulled out another sheet of paper. This one was for Dr. Harris. "Dear Dr. Harris," she began, "your kindness helped me through something I never thought I'd survive. When fear threatened to overwhelm me, your steady presence gave me strength. Thank you for not just treating my condition, but for seeing me as a person who needed compassion as much as medicine." As she wrote, memories of the past weeks washed over her. The initial terror, the desire to run away, the moment she finally chose to fight. Her hand trembled slightly as she remembered how close she'd come to giving up. At noon, Maggie stood by her mailbox, both letters sealed and ready to go. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Buddy sat beside her, his tail sweeping gentle arcs in the grass. She raised the red flag on the mailbox and took a deep breath. "We made it, Bud," she whispered, reaching down to scratch his ears. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink, casting long shadows across Maggie's front porch. She sat in her favorite wicker chair, a soft blanket draped over her legs despite the mild temperature. Buddy lounged beside her, his golden fur catching the dying sunlight. Maggie's fingers traced gentle patterns through his coat, pausing occasionally to examine the spots that had once filled her with such dread. They had faded to almost nothing now, like memories of a bad dream. His fur felt thick and healthy under her touch, his eyes bright with contentment. "Look at you," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "All better now." The gentle autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Maggie closed her eyes, drawing in a deep breath. The air felt different somehow, cleaner, fresher, more alive. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. She thought about the past few weeks, how close she had come to making the wrong choice. If she had ignored Buddy's warning signs, if she had let her fear win. She shuddered slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. But that wasn't how the story had ended. Instead, she had faced her fears. She had fought. And now, sitting here with Buddy on this beautiful evening, she realized something extraordinary. The constant fear that had been her companion for so long was gone. Since losing Richard, she had lived in the shadow of loss, always waiting for the next tragedy to strike. That fear had become so familiar, she'd almost stopped noticing it, like a chronic ache you learn to live with. But now, in its absence, she felt lighter, freer. The setting sun painted the clouds in deeper shades of rose and gold. Maggie watched the colors shift and change, fully present in this peaceful moment. No anxiety about tomorrow, no regrets about yesterday. Just now, just here, just breathing. Buddy shifted closer, resting his head on her lap. She looked down at him, this faithful friend who had quite literally saved her life. "Thank you," she whispered softly. He responded with a gentle lick to her hand and settled back with a contented sigh. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window as Maggie stirred awake. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the morning light, and felt a familiar warmth pressed against her side. Buddy lay there, snoring softly, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered, running her fingers through his silky fur. Buddy's eyes fluttered open, and he gave her a sleepy look that seemed filled with understanding. His tail thumped lazily against the mattress. "You saved my life, you know that?" Her voice caught slightly. "All those times you wouldn't leave me alone, trying to tell me something was wrong." Buddy lifted his head and pressed his nose against her hand, as if to say he'd do it all again. Later that morning, Maggie drove into town, letters carefully tucked in her purse. The autumn air felt crisp and invigorating as she walked into the post office. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully. "Morning, Maggie," called Sarah, the postal clerk. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy," Maggie replied, surprised by how natural it felt to smile. She handed over her letters, knowing each one carried her deepest gratitude to the doctors who had helped save her life. At the grocery store, she took her time selecting fresh fruits and vegetables. The cashier, young Tommy from down the street, chatted with her about his college plans. "That's wonderful," Maggie said, genuinely interested. She realized she'd stopped engaging with people like this, stopped caring about their stories. Now each interaction felt like a gift. As she loaded her groceries into the car, she paused to look up at the clear blue sky. The fear that had gripped her heart for so long was gone, replaced by something lighter, brighter. She felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The drive home was peaceful. Windows rolled down to let in the sweet autumn air. Her hair danced in the breeze, and she found herself humming along to the radio, something she hadn't done since Richard was alive. But this time, the memory didn't sting. Instead, it felt like a warm reminder of all the joy life still held. The phone's ring echoed through the quiet house. Maggie picked it up, recognizing Dr. Harris's office number. "Mrs. Lawson, just calling to remind you about your post-surgery checkup next week," the receptionist said cheerfully. "Yes, of course." Maggie walked to her calendar, pen already in hand. She wrote the appointment time without a second thought. No racing heart, no sweaty palms. Just a simple task, like marking down a lunch date. Buddy watched from his spot by the window as she hung up the phone. His tail wagged slowly, approval clear in his warm brown eyes. Later that morning, Maggie found herself standing in front of Richard's old closet. She'd kept everything exactly as it was. His favorite sweater still hanging on the hook. His reading glasses still perched on top of medical documents from 5 years ago. Taking a deep breath, she reached for a cardboard box. Her hands didn't shake as she carefully folded the sweater. She pressed it to her face one last time, breathing in what remained of his scent. "I'll always love you," she whispered, placing it in the donation box. "But it's time to make room for living." One by one, she sorted through the items. Some she kept, their wedding album, his favorite book with notes scribbled in the margins. Others she packed away for donation, clothes that would keep someone else warm, books that would tell their stories to new readers. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but they weren't the heavy tears of grief anymore. They felt lighter somehow, like rain after a long drought. Buddy padded into the room, pressing against her leg. She knelt down beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Thank you for showing me how to be brave," she murmured into his fur. By mid-afternoon, several boxes stood neatly labeled by the door. Maggie stepped onto the porch, Buddy following close behind. They settled into their usual spots, her in the old rocking chair, him at her feet. The autumn wind picked up, sending leaves dancing through the air. Maggie watched them twirl and float, feeling oddly peaceful. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore, wasn't just existing in the spaces between grief. She was living, really living. Buddy rested his head on her knee, and she scratched behind his ears, both of them content in the quiet afternoon light. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Maggie clipped Buddy's leash to his collar. His tail wagged eagerly. It had been weeks since their last proper walk together. "Come on, Bud, let's go," she said, closing the front door behind them. They started down the familiar sidewalk, fallen leaves crunching beneath their feet. Buddy's pace matched hers perfectly, just like always. The surgical site still felt a bit tender, but Maggie walked tall, breathing in the crisp air. Main Street looked different somehow. The old bookstore where she used to hide during those first lonely months after Richard's passing now seemed warm and inviting. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chen arranging new arrivals on the display shelf. "Maggie," Mrs. Chen called out, waving through the glass. "So good to see you up and about." Maggie waved back, smiling genuinely. They passed the cafe where she and Richard had spent countless Sunday mornings. The memory didn't sting like it used to. "Well, look who's back on her feet," Tom from the hardware store called out. He was sweeping the sidewalk in front of his shop. "How are you feeling?" "Better every day," Maggie replied, meaning it. They continued their walk, stopping occasionally to chat with neighbors. Each conversation felt like threading herself back into the fabric of the community. Buddy stayed close, his presence steady and reassuring. As they reached the walking trail's end, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Maggie paused to watch it sink below the horizon. The golden light caught Buddy's fur, making it shimmer. His coat was healthy again, no trace of the dark spots that had once been a warning sign. She knelt beside him, running her fingers through his soft fur. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the ones who save us walk on 4 legs." Buddy turned and licked her hand gently as if to say, "I know." If you enjoyed the story of Maggie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.